Well, with that, if you would all please give a warm welcome to Dr. Clary.
Thank you so much. If you're not familiar with Acts and Facts, this is one of them. We have some in the back that are free. These are free. So there's not everything for purchase. There's stuff that's for free as well. So, and if you've already signed up, how many people get Acts and Facts already? If you want to get in that drawing, sign up, but don't put your address. Or just say, so you need to be on the list to get in the drawing at the end of the second service. So, and you must be present to win. So if you leave and you don't wait for the drawing, then we'll give it to somebody else. But someone else will appreciate it as well. So anyway, they have Acts and Facts up there for you if you want, and we'll see how this goes. So we're going to try to get through this talk. We switched them up. We're going to do the truth of the global flood first, which is a little bit more science-y than my next talk. But there's a little bit of dinosaurs in here you'll see as well. About partway through with a little dinosaur video clip in or two, just to liven up the audience. Because, I don't want you to fall asleep as we go through this. But I want to thank my co-author here, Davis J. Warner, which is almost David's name, but it's not him. But my co-author is an undergraduate student, and he uses a pseudonym because he doesn't want people to out him as a creationist, which is unfortunate. We have to do that type of thing. But he helps me with all the maps that you're going to see today. So if you don't like the maps, we blame him. But I take the blame for everything else and pretty much what we're doing. But we'll go on. But it's really exciting research. I've been at ICR for 10 years now, almost to the day. And it's just a joy. I never thought I'd be at ICR. I took, the Genesis flood, I read a lot of that as an undergrad myself. That's all we have. But now we're putting out information showing that there really is evidence of a global flood. And that's what you'll see today. So if you don't understand everything in my talk today, at least you'll hopefully get the point. There's a lot of data that I'm going to try to summarize in a short amount of time. And so one of the questions that, again, these worked yesterday. Do they not work today? How do they not work today? How does this happen? How does this happen? There was a nice video there. Maybe you won't see the dinosaurs today. Is there something we did wrong? We don't know. We're just going to have to move on. All right, the guys in the back are trying to figure something out, but it's unfortunate. Well, anyway, we'll move right along. But there's a big question if we go back. Let me go back, see if I can go back one. And we'll start over. Let's see if the chat works. Everything's stopped now. Okay, well, we'll skip that one. I won't go back to it. Goes right over it. Well, many influential leaders deny, unfortunately, a global flood. You hear a lot of scientists, of course, they disavow there was evidence of a global flood. Back in the 19th century, geologists decided they're going to take the writings of Moses out of science. And so they started developing an alternative story, which you all know, you all hear all the time, that dinosaurs, of course, lived millions of years ago. There was no global flood. There might have been a local flood, but the Bible is wrong, blah, blah, blah. And unfortunately, a lot of scientific leaders and also Christian leaders, seminaries teach the same sort of thing. And so you go to seminary and you'll hear a lot of old earth and a lot of local flood stories instead of a global flood. But there's really a lot of evidence for it. In 2 Peter 3, God predicted this through the writings of Peter. He said, there shall come in the last days scoffers, walking after their own lusts. For this they willingly are ignorant, that by the word of God the heavens of old, earth stand out of water, in the water. Basically, they deny the creation that God said he did everything out of water. And whereby the world that then was, being overflowed with water, perished. And so people are going to deny there was a global flood. And sure enough, that's what we see today in the world. People deny a global flood. They don't see the evidence. They ask me all the time, where's the evidence for a global flood? And I just tell people, look down. Because you're standing on thousands of feet of rock in most places of the world that are filled with fossils that were buried in the flood. And here in Texas, you're standing on some of the highest water point. You reach kind of the water, when the water is reaching its peak, you're standing on those rocks. Not quite the peak, but pretty close. And so you've got thousands of feet of sediment below you that show there really was a flood. So we're going to look at 3 truths of the flood today in the Bible. The Bible, of course, we believe is true, every word. But when you start looking at the evidence, I started looking at the rocks. Let's see what the rocks really do show. And so we'll see there really is strong evidence of a global flood, and it was a catastrophic flood. It was not a flood of your bathtub, just kind of filling up. It was a very violent flood. These waves are coming in, just like tsunami waves, huge waves, bigger than we've ever seen in history. The pre-flood history is much more violent, as we'll see. And third and finally, it was a recent flood. It didn't happen millions of years ago. It didn't happen, back like the evolutionists say, billions and millions of years ago. They believe in floods too, as we'll see. They believe in 6 floods that flooded across North America. This is North America supposedly in about the Cambrian, which would be the first flood. We'll talk about this, called the Sauk sequence. So they believe this is their rendition of North America about that time. So a lot of North America flooded. Most of Canada there is high and dry, but you can see Texas is down there at the bottom. This is the second flood, third flood, the fourth flood, the fifth flood, and the sixth flood. So they do see evidence of flooding. Most of the sedimentary rocks are laid down by water. And even the ones that they say aren't laid down by water, there is some evidence that they were laid down by water. Like some of these big sandstones they try to say are sand dunes. There's actually a lot of minerals in there that indicate they were water deposited. That's another story. So they do see the evidence of this. And this is their sea level curve that they use, that you see in most textbooks. You'll see this sea level curve that went up. And the way it kind of works is the graph kind of shows on the right side, or the left side, you can see their curve. And then on this one, he's kind of jumped ahead of me a little bit. I show a progressive flood. And so this particular, I don't know if it works on any of these TV screens, it doesn't work. I'm going to step back over here behind Stan, the T-Rex. And you can see they show a high sea level curve down here, then it goes down and back up, and I just show a progressive flood. And that's what I presented at a Geological Society of America meeting a few years ago. And they're like, because that's what the data shows. The data doesn't support this. But we're going to look at these in these sequences, these what we call mega sequences now, as chapters of the flood. And so the way stratigraphy is done, the way you correlate rocks from place to place around the world, they kind of name these in these mega sequences, large packages of rock that were deposited in these big floods. So even, again, the secular community believes there is floods of the earth. They just don't think it flooded everything. And so they think it came in and backed off a little bit, and it came in again and backed off. And each time it came in, it deposited a lot of sediment, and then it kind of backed off. And that's kind of what we're going to do. So the traditional time scale is over there on the left side, and the sequences on the right side, and I just numbered them 1 through 6. So that's those 6 floods they talk about. But really, there was only one flood, as we'll see. This is the one major flood that kind of progressed along, all in the year. So when I started this, I started looking at data. Instead of pulling up oil well data, I said, well, I'm experiencing oil and gas. Let's give it a look, and we'll see what the data really shows. Now, I believe the Bible is true. I believe there was a global flood. I said, let's see what the rocks show. And I was a little nervous, because I'm like, hopefully the rocks show this. And as I studied along, continent by continent by continent, I'm seeing the picture really does support a global flood, but it's really observable data. Anyone else could do the same thing I'm doing if they want to spend 10 years of their life compiling data. And we do other things as well. But because I'm working at ICR, it allows me to do this research. And so those of you that support ICR, you're allowing this research to be done. It wasn't done until I came to ICR. No one's done this research. No one's ever done anything like this in at least the last 40, 50 years, or at least it hasn't been published by anybody. If the oil companies do this, ours didn't, because we're too busy looking for little individual oil prospects. And nobody looks at the big picture. Nobody looks at continent by continent or the whole world. And so this is a very new data set that no one else has, that we've been compiling for the last 10 years. And we're now working on our 6th continent. So you'll see in all my maps today, Australia is blank, because I'm working on Australia presently. It isn't that it didn't flood. It's just that we don't have the data in there yet. We're actively working on that. Just Friday, I was putting in some data points for Australia. We've compiled the data. We look at these columns. So if you drilled a well right here all the way down to the crust, how many thousands of feet? We do it in meters to confuse the general audience. But we use metric in science because it makes us look smart. I'm convinced that's why we do. But it works in all the equations. If you're a physicist, everything's in chemistry. It's all in metric type of system. So we use meters. But nonetheless, it's how many meters of sandstone, shale, limestone, whatever you drill through, all the way down to the crust. And I kind of simplified the geology into about 16 different rock types. There's a lot more sedimentary rocks than that, but you can kind of simplify them into that. So I went with that, and then the 6 mega sequences I keep track of, and even a pre-Sauk mega sequence. So I added the 7th one down below, because there's some indication that the flood started a little bit earlier than even the Cambrian and the Sauk sequence in some locations. But there's an example from my home state of Michigan over there as well, on the far left. So we've got over 3,000 columns now. We're actively, for the whole world, that doesn't sound like a lot, but it covers every major basin every major offshore basin, every major area of the world is actually represented. Every uplift is represented in this database. One's doing this type of research that I know of, but it's a lot of fun. For me, it's almost like opening a Christmas present every time I get a new continent done. And as a geologist, that's what makes us go. And some of you are like, this guy's nuts. But it is a lot of fun because you can finally see I'm getting to see more geology than most anybody else in the world has ever seen. And so I'm a little bit, I don't understand all of it, obviously, but I know enough to be dangerous. But we do believe that all these deposits, all these 6 sequences were all deposited in the year of the flood. That's what the Bible tells us. And as we'll see, there's no reason not to. Here's what the Bible does say about the flood. It says, in the 600th year of Noah's life, were all the fountains of the great deep broken up, the windows of heaven were opened. So it starts with Genesis 7, 10, and 11. Kind of begins there. And the earth, of course, as we'll get into a little bit later, is the only planet that has these tectonic plates. And I believe they started in Genesis 7, 11 when the fountains of the deep burst open. So this is based on a lot of my research that we did earlier. This is our pre-world map, pre-flood map of the world, the way God created it. And there's the continents. They're all kind of in sort of a Pangea, but not quite the Pangea that you know and love, that you heard about in school, but a very similar pattern to this Pangea. And so North America is kind of in the middle there. Texas is there as well. But what we're trying to show here in the white is the fountains bursting. So when the fountains burst, there's probably a lot of volcanic activity, and a lot of water comes out with volcanoes, a lot of gases are given off as well. So there's a lot of water spreading around. And again, as I mentioned earlier, the Earth is the only planet with tectonic plates that actually moved. There's a lot of other planets that have cracks and fractures because they cool, but they don't have plates that actually moved. And so I think this is unique to Earth because this is the only planet that actually flooded. Now, people argue that Mars flooded, but there's not a drop of water on Mars today. Here we have the Earth filled with 70% water. This averages about 2 miles or so deep, and yet they don't think the Earth ever flooded. But they believe Mars did. There's not a drop of water on it. And so it's really kind of odd what scientists are saying today, because you could easily push all that water up and flood the Earth, and that's really what. These big mountains today didn't exist in the pre-flood world, so you didn't have to go 26,000 feet. You might have only had to flood 4,000 or 5,000 feet to flood the whole Earth, as we'll see. But it is interesting that Earth is the only planet that has these plates, and I believe that's what was the mechanism God used for the flood. So it goes on in Genesis 7:12. It says, the rain is on the earth 40 days and 40 nights. And I believe this might have been the time period when you're depositing those first 3 mega sequences, the first 3 chapters, as we'll see later. And you mostly just deposit marine fossils at this point. So I kind of go back to our chart here, and you kind of follow along if you want. This is. And the guy that named all these named them after North American native tribes. And so the last one we'll see later is the Tejas. You guys are more familiar with Tejas, aren't you? In Texas. It's a Texas tribe of Native Americans. And so we'll see as we go along. But we'll just look at chapters 1 to 3. And in these chapters, I don't believe the earth really flooded too much. You'll see the curve there kind of starts to move a little bit. But it gets higher later, as we see. And John Baumgartner, a world-renowned geophysicist, came up with this theory of rapid plate movement, or called catastrophic plate tectonics. And he developed this back in the 1990s. He started working on this computer model. He was working for a government research lab, and they said, oh, go ahead and do whatever you want. You're a good enough physicist, you can play around with your own ideas as well. So he started working out this model of taking a Pangea and breaking it apart, but he showed that the mathematics of the way the Earth is composed today would have actually caused rapid movement. As opposed to today, the plates are moving about this much per year. During the flood, he said they would move this much per second. So you have rapid movement. You can create a whole new ocean seafloor in the year of the flood. And that appears to be what happened. But no one has disputed his math. No one has said, oh, Dr. Baumgartner, you got this wrong or that wrong. The secular community doesn't want to believe it. They want to believe uniformitarianism. They always believe, what they see today has always been the same. So they think it's always been this fast. They don't want to believe that the conditions are there that would show the plates would subduct and move fast enough. It's just if you're dropping the weight in water. And so once you reach a certain critical temperature, he says it would just move real quickly. And he modeled it out and shows that that's really what would happen. And again, nobody has disputed his math. No one said, oh, you got a plus sign wrong and a minus sign wrong here or there. They just ignore him because it's not mainstream science, so they just ignore you. But he's So we have this rapid subduction going on, rapid creation of new plates in the ocean. The ocean basically created itself anew during the flood year. And even the uniformitarian scientists show the ocean is very young compared to the rest of the continents. So the continents did move around very rapidly. There's still slow subduction today, about this much per year. And so we still see some earthquakes, some major disasters associated with these plates, like California, Washington, the recent one in Turkey, for example. All these are on near plate boundaries where most of the earthquakes do occur. But during the flood year, of course, you'd have had massive earthquakes, much, much bigger than we witnessed, and massive tsunami waves because of it. So, and you can still see this is still cold. In fact, underneath North America today, they shoot seismic tomography across North America, and you see these slabs from the subduction that goes still way underneath North America. And you can go all around the Pacific, you can see this seismic tomography shows cold slabs all the way down to the core sometimes. The reason these things are cold is because they went down there so fast. They haven't had time to heat up. So these cold slabs they're seeing is really an argument for a recent and rapid plate movement. Not like what they teach you in school. It took millions and millions of years. There's really strong evidence because these are still so cold that they had to go down there recently, about 4,000 years ago, 4,500 years ago. So all over the world you see cold slabs deep in the earth. And it makes you wonder, why are they still cold? You put your hand in an oven, it's going to get hot after a while. And these slabs are about 60 miles thick, and they should heat up after millions and millions of years, but they're still showing that they're still, the densities still indicate they're really cold. And so it's a big enigma to the secular community. But it's not if you believe in the flood. You believe the plates move fast in the flood year. So, of course, moving of plates are going to cause tsunamis. This is the one in Japan a few years ago. It's kind of cheating because it's a seawall that's going over. But we're looking at waves that might have been 100, 200, maybe even 500 foot high flying by. And I think we lost everything there. Okay, we're back. And so when you start to spread, the tsunamis, of course, start to cross the continents as you go through. And I move the continents to today's configuration. So we don't have to show moving through time, though they did. These were still fairly well connected at the time this happened. This is that first sequence, the Sauk mega sequence. This shows where the rocks are today from that mega sequence. And so if it's white, it didn't flood that area. Again, ignore Australia, because Australia is not on here. If you're up close enough, you can see there's little data points down there, all these data points. And you can see Canada was still high and dry. You can see most of Africa was still high and dry. You see most of South America was still high and dry. It's still white. So those areas didn't flood early in the flood year. And so that's the evidence that this was a progressive flood, as you'll see along. And so you go to the next sequence. Well, we'll zoom in a little bit in the Sauk sequence here first. And here's North America. And you can see Texas down there is covered in yellow. And my home state of Michigan covered in yellow. And you see most of the Rockies covered in yellow. There's one big continuous sandstone. It's about maybe on the average as thick as this room. That covers that whole area. And it's difficult for the uniformitarian geologist to explain what these are called blanket sands. Blanket deposits that cover whole huge areas of continents that are all deposited almost at once. A flood makes sense. Slow movement over millions of years doesn't make as much sense because you should see different rocks. It shouldn't be the same sandstone, which is what that yellow represents. So if you're a geologist, yellow usually means sandstone. Geologist in the room today, so you might not know, but yellow, that's the sandstone. As you can go to the different places, you can see the pictures. In my home state of Michigan, the pictured rocks up in Lake Superior are the same sandstone as the Tapete sandstone down in Grand Canyon. And if you drill here down a few thousand feet down, you'll hit the same sandstone. It's still there. It's all across the whole United States. And it's represented, to me, it's evidence of a flood. You go to the next sequence that's piled on top of the Sauk. You see the Tippecanoe floods about the same areas. A little more of South America is flooded, maybe a little less of North America. But again, you don't see much in Africa, maybe just the very southern tip. But most of Africa is still high and dry. Most of Canada is still high and dry, and Greenland included. Go to the Kaskaskia, same story. A little bit more flooding maybe in Europe, northern Europe, particularly offshore, off northern Russia. But you don't see a lot of difference between the first three sequences. It's because you're slowly progressing a little bit higher each time. The waves are coming in, they kind of back off. The waves came in and backed off, and they came in a little bit higher each time. And so these first three sequences, you look at the rock record, and what the fossils they contain are mostly all marine fossils. 99.9% of all the fossils found in these first three chapters or sequences are marine. So I believe you're only flooding shallow seas at this point. Maybe some of the deeper ocean is being brought in And so you see differences in the fossils, but it's all pretty much dry. The dry land is still dry land. The rain was coming down. There was a lot of, rainfall activity, but what was being carried in and being deposited was mostly just marine fossils at this point. So that's why it's limited flooding. You didn't flood the land yet. But again, things change. The flood continued on. And so by day 40, I think you're starting to flood the land because the Bible tells us this. So here we go, day 40 to 150, chapters 4 to 5. And the flood was 40 days upon the earth, and the waters increased and bare up the ark. So by day 40 or thereabout, the ark starts to float. And so they were sitting there for 40 days. All the 8 humans in there, all the animals, 2 of every kind, thousands and thousands of different animals, all sitting on this ark. Plenty of room on the ark for more people. The ark is probably only half full with animals. People have done studies, how many kinds of animals you need. We'll talk about in the next talk, dinosaurs, how many dinosaurs had to be on the ark. Really not that many, but then they probably didn't bring the big ones because the big ones, they're old. Just like crocodiles, the bigger you were, the older you were. And so the ones that are going to reproduce are going to be the young ones, and they take up less room. And so the waters prevailed exceedingly, so the waters were increased greatly, the waters prevailed exceedingly. You read through the yellow, so the waters increased, prevailed, increased greatly, prevailed exceedingly. You get the idea the water was going higher and higher, and that's exactly what the geology shows. That's exactly what catastrophic plate tectonics would predict. The more ocean crust you make, the hotter it is. Hot new crust is more buoyant, just like hot air balloons go up. Hot crust goes up and pushes the water up from below. And so the more ocean crust that was being created rapidly during the flood year, the more you push water onto the land. That's exactly what the rocks are showing. So there's a perfect match between the production of new seafloor rapidly during the flood year and the progressive flooding of the land. And so John Baumgartner and I got a chance to speak about a year ago, almost to the day again, in Houston. I don't know if any of you were there, but he spoke about his idea of catastrophic plate tectonics. And I got a chance to show, here's the evidence on the land. Here's what the rocks show. Really verifies what he. So here's the flood, moving along, moving the ark, launching the ark. And you got to remember the ark was salvation. If you got on the ark, you were saved from the judgment of the flood. Now, the flood was a judgment for the wickedness of humanity, which we're seeing again. As Jesus predicted, we were going to become more like the days of Noah. And so the world is going to get continually more wicked. And the Bible tells us how bad it was. It was constant, people, that's all people thought about. Violence and wickedness. And when the door was shut, when God shut the door on the ark, of course, the fate of anybody outside the ark was sealed. And only 8 people got on the ark. Noah, his wife, and 3 sons of Noah, and their 3 wives. That was it. No other family members even got on the ark. Noah's mother-in-law didn't get on the ark. Whether she was alive or not, they don't say in the Bible. But a lot of people, they just didn't believe there was going to be a flood. Noah preached and preached and preached for decades as they were building the ark, and people didn't believe it. Today, people scoff at the idea of a flood, even though the evidence is right there before your feet. I can see in Noah's day, there never was a flood. They didn't even have probably local floods back in those days. Now we have local floods all the time as reminders, and we have the evidence below our feet, all these rocks that show there really was a global flood, and people still don't believe. But the point here is Jesus is now the door of salvation. The ark was salvation for these people. If they would have just entered through that door, they would be saved. But God himself loves us so much that he came to earth. Took on the form of a human. Lived on the earth 33 years or so, and then knew that he would have to die painfully on a cross. But that's what God was willing to do to save each and every one of us. To shed his blood on that cross. Finish the job of pay the price for our sinfulness. My sins and your sins. He paid it all. And he's opened that door of salvation again. He says, I am the door. By me, if any man enter in, he shall be saved and go in and out and find pasture. Just like salvation, the ark door was salvation, Jesus has now opened salvation to all. So we have that opportunity while we're alive today to make that decision for Christ. To walk through that door of salvation. It's very simple. All you have to do is believe. All the people back in those days had to do is believe enough. Okay, I'm going to believe you, Noah. I'll get on the ark, but only 8 people did. There might have been 1 billion people on the earth at that time that died in the flood as the water kept progressing. And it took about 150 days to reach the peak, the Bible tells us. So it was a very, very slow, steady flood very violent flood, but it took a long time. God could have flooded it quicker, but he tells us what he did in the Bible. It kept getting higher and higher and higher. Eventually, by day 150, everybody was dead. Every air-breathing animal, including all the humans that weren't on the ark, were dead by day 150. So here's we're progressing toward that. The Absaroka sequence, I call it, because I went to school in Wyoming. You might say Absaroka. It's up to you. But this is when things got really bad. So I think this is after day 40, because the ark was floating. We now know we're flooding the land if the ark is floating. So now we start to see land animals and coal seams show up and the splitting of the continent. See, now the video is working great. Good job, guys. And you can see this rapid splitting of the continents was taking place and the creation of a new ocean crust I talked about earlier. All those colors represent the ages of the ocean crust. The red is the youngest. And right down the middle of the ocean, like the Atlantic, that's the very youngest, still happening today, this much per year. It's still kind of oozing out a little bit, but during the flood year, of course, it was humming right along, this much per second. And so you made this real big ocean called the Pacific. The oldest crust is in blue, but that goes back to the Absaroka sequence. So there's no ocean crust that's those first three sequences at all. They all were consumed. So the original ocean crust of the earth was consumed during the flood year and moved the continents around. And I think there's a reason for that I won't get into at this point. But a lot of it has to do with ocean currents to kind of keep our earth livable. If we had one big continent today, I think we'd be in trouble. So the ocean crust, as I talked about, as you make new ocean crust, even today we see these ocean ridges sticking up, but the whole ocean crust was being pushed up from below because it was all hot as it was being created so quickly. And so that pushed the water up. Just like the bottom of your bathtub going up is going to flood more over the top. The water is incompressible for the most part, and it's going to just go over the top. And that's what happened. These waves, the tsunami waves from the earthquakes kept going higher and higher and higher because the water was pushing up from below. And so we see these tsunami waves now flooding land, taking away vegetation. We see even today it strips away vegetation, washes people out to sea. We have dinosaurs out in the North Sea. They were washed all the way out to the North Sea, 70 miles from Norway now. They drilled an oil well down 1.5 miles deep. They pulled up a bone of a dinosaur they could identify. So they weren't just being washed under land, they were being washed out to sea as well. And humans and dinosaurs and fossils, all sorts of things. Here we see the first appearance of coal beds in the world in the Absaroka sequence. There's a couple coal seams before this, but hardly any. So now we know we're flooding the land. We're getting land animals showing up in the fossils and coal from plants being buried as well. So we see swampy type animals, reptiles that lived in swampy areas, swampy coal type plants, and we see marine animals being washed in because those waves are bringing in marine animals. Those big tsunami waves, 400 or 500 foot high, bigger than anything we see today. You know, a tsunami today that's 40 feet high is devastating, but these were 10 times that big. So we see the Absaroka now starts to cover more of the continents. You see more of North America is covered, at least the United States particularly. You see a little more of Africa is covered. You see a little more of South America is covered. Now you don't see continually, this is what's there today. There's been a lot of erosion and uplift since these were deposited, so you don't see continuous deposition, but you see a lot of Asia is covered by the flood as well. Again, Australia, I don't have done. So here's what the world probably looked like by day 90. I tried to label what's left of North America, mostly Canada, a little strip coming down. Africa and South America are still together at this time. And then those other pieces are parts of Asia and even India, that little piece down there. But there wasn't a whole lot left. You're flooding a lot of the earth at this point. And so we move on to our Zuni sequence. This is includes the Cretaceous, the rocks you have below your feet here mostly. These particular rocks, I believe, was the high point of the flood. Even the secular scientists think this was a high point. They just think there was an earlier one, which I don't see the evidence for. But there's one peak, and I think this is it. So this is when dinosaurs were buried. They were finally wiped out. They were probably survived the first 50, 60, 70 days of the flood, maybe even up to day 100. But eventually, they were buried as well as the water came across. And we see in North America, a lot of our dinosaurs are here in Texas and up through the Rockies. And there's a reason for that. The reason for that is when you look at the rocks and you see what was buried first, if you recall, was those blue areas. Those are very thick. So this is right from one of our maps, our thickness maps of those first three sequences. So this is the areas that were flooding. And then the pre-flood uplands, I believe, was up in Canada, that green area. That would have been the highest ground. Everything thins towards Canada. So all these sequences are filling in first, and nothing was being deposited, if you recall, up in Canada or in much of Africa or South America. And then down that yellow area, I think, was kind of a lowland area, which I call Dinosaur Peninsula. That's where our dinosaurs were living, I think, in the pre-flood world. And as they were washed off, of course, they were buried near these areas as well. That's why they're buried where they are. They're not found in Michigan, my home state, because that was a shallow sea. They didn't live there. And so it depends where the dinosaurs lived. They didn't wash off too far from where they lived. But it all kind of makes sense when you start plotting up the data, building up, what was buried first, what was second, what was third. And so what you find in Indiana and Michigan and Ohio is mostly marine fossils. What you find out here in Texas and up through the Rockies are dinosaurs. You can find marine fossils as well because they're all mixed in. As the waves came in, they mixed in with marine fossils. And if you were to find a lot of rocks up in Canada, but it's been stripped right down to the crust, as the waves came across the highest hills, they stripped right down to the crust, you probably would have found a lot of your mammals, and most of your humans were probably living in what's now Canada, at least in North America. Brazil and India and Antarctica and other places of the world. So where was Adam and Eve, I don't really know, but I'm at least getting a clue where was the highest ground in the pre-flood world by what filled in first. And so you can see in North America, it's rather interesting. So you see some of these big mammals buried on top of the dinosaurs because they were washed off the highest hills and spread all over the earth. And so you see, like in Badlands National Park, you see mostly mammals and layers above the dinosaur layers. So the dinosaurs end up being about the middle ground because they were the kind of lowlands of the world. So they're in the middle, they're called the Jurassic, Triassic, and Cretaceous layers. But above that, you see mostly mammals. Below that, you see mostly marine rocks. That's just the way the flood progressed. Here's the Zuni mega sequence. This is the high point of the flood. Again, ignore Australia and New Guinea, although some of that's done. But you might say, but Tim, it doesn't flood everything. It did. It just didn't leave a lot behind. And there's been erosion since then in an ice age, et cetera, that scraped away a lot of this material as well. But if you look up in Canada, you see a couple little blue dots by Hudson Bay, way, way up there. See those little blue dots? So it shows what I call the bathtub ring. Because those sediments didn't get there, they had to be brought in from the sides. They can't just drop them off like on a drone drop. The sediments had to wash in. So you have to cover Canada as well. The Bible tells us why there's not much in Canada. There's mostly just crystal and rock where the sediments are eroded away. Because when you reach the high point of the flood, here's those little dots in Canada. You can see there is evidence of water going over the top. The water looked like this. The Bible tells us on day 150, this is the earth. The ark is there somewhere. You can't see it, it's too small. It's only 500 feet long or so. But this is what the world looked like on day 150. And the Bible tells us the water went 15 cubits, they're only 23 feet above the highest hills. So it's zipping across Canada and across Brazil and across these highest ground areas, stripping it right down to the crust. At 60, 70 miles an hour, the tsunami waves move 500 miles an hour in the open ocean. When they get our land, of course, they slow down due to friction, but they're still zipping right across, probably 60 miles an hour. And so they stripped it right down to the crust and wiped out humanity, just like the Bible says he was going to do. And you didn't leave a lot behind. If you have 15 feet of, or 23 feet of water, you can't leave a lot of sediment behind. So there's maybe just a couple of feet of sediment. So you see a few remnants in Canada, and that's all you see. Moving on to the mega sequences, the Zuni and Apsarica, you see, again, a lot of marine fossils. They show they're mixed with dinosaurs. We actually find this thing buried with sharks in the same rock layer. So there's 6 species of sharks. There's actually one, Tyrannosaurus rex sioux, one of the biggest T-Rexes ever found. It's in the Field Museum in Chicago. They found a tooth right underneath, shark tooth right underneath where they dug it out. So there's a lot of sharks and marine animals found with dinosaurs. There's constant mixing. I read about this on our website all the time. Where do these secular scientists say, well, those are all freshwater sharks. You know, they find coelacanth fish, which are now living in the deep ocean in the Indonesia area and off Africa. They were supposed to be extinct. There's no fossils of them since the time of dinosaurs. But they found them living. They're a classic living fossil. And they're found with Spinosaurus in Morocco. And they go, oh, those must have been freshwater fish, just because they're found with dinosaurs. But there's no evidence they were freshwater fish. They look exactly like the fish today living in the deep ocean. But they make the story fit. And they tell with a straight face. You know, they're all freshwater sharks. You know, these are all freshwater herring. And these are all, and they change the story. It's like playing a Monopoly game and your brother changes the rules all the time. I was the youngest of 4 brothers. And so they changed the rules on me all the time. That's what the evolutionists do. They change the rules all the time to fit the story. But they have the microphone. And the microphone works better than the one I'm using today. So I faded it out a little bit, but hopefully it's not too big. You can hear me. It's the Michigan accent, I know, is what you can't understand. So just imagine you're watching a hockey game and I'm announcing. Hear the Canadian accent going on there. Anyway, that's all you got to do. We went to Canada a lot. A lot of good rocks in Canada. So let's look at the receding phase, because you guys are like, is this flood ever going to end? Well, after 150 days, everything was dead. If you went on the ark, it was dead. You couldn't escape the flood. The waters kept coming higher and higher. Sure, people tried to build boats, but those boats weren't big enough to withstand the waves, the tsunami waves of the flood. And so whatever you tried to build, if you weren't in that huge ark, you weren't going to be safe. And if the ark floats way, way out in the deep ocean, it's going to be pretty safe. Today, when there's tsunami warnings, our Navy goes out to sea. As long as you're not near land, you don't really get hit by those tsunami waves. They just zip across the bottom of the ocean. And so a lot of fish and whales and animals, a lot of them didn't get caught in the flood because they didn't get pushed onto the land, but there was a lot that did. And so I think if you're a human trying to survive, those waves just kept coming across. And you tried to build boats, you tried to hang on to stuff, but the waves are too fast and too big and too violent for you to survive. God made a wind to pass over the earth, the Bible says, and the waters assuaged and went back and forth. Fountains of the deep, the windows of heaven were stopped. The rain from heaven was restrained. And the waters returned from off the earth continually at the end of 150 days. The waters abated. And the ark actually grounds on day 150 as well, over in the mountains of Ararat. This is what the world shows today. Because what happened is the ocean once it was created, of course, it started to cool. And as it cooled, it sank. So the ocean crust of the world, except for these ridges, you can still see the ridges through the middle of the oceans, that made the oceans. You can see those are still sticking up because there's still a lot of heat coming up in those little areas, but not like during the flood year when all the bottom of the ocean was up. A lot of it has cooled and sank now, and that's what we see. So as it cooled and sank, it drew the water off, and God had a wind as well. And these green areas are the thickest areas in the Gulf of Mexico, for example, in the Bay of Bengal, and off the Amazon River in the Niger Delta, all these places we get lots of thick sediment, particularly in Southeast Asia, very, very thick. So the colors represent the thickness as well. And you look at North America, you see there's this huge whopper sand in the Gulf of Mexico that's 100 to 200 miles offshore in 10,000 feet of water. And it's in places almost 2,000 feet thick. Pure sand almost, with a little bit of shale in the middle of it. Discovered in the 2000s. They found 15 billion barrels of oil in it, but no secular geologist can explain how it got there. My Chevron chief geologist came to hear me send a poster on this at a conference a few years back. And he was in his 80s. I'm going to see what you're up to, Tim. And I told him about the whopper sand. I said, you wouldn't even let us look that far offshore for sand because there's no model to get sand that far offshore. So we're looking 200 miles or more offshore. They still have no model to get sand that far. But yet here's a sand with a flat bottom and a flat top. No transition at all. Just boom, like you dumped a huge load of sand that covers the whole middle of the Gulf of Mexico. How'd that get out there without the receding phase of the flood? The high energy washing off the parking lot when it rains really hard, how it washes off. That initial pulse of draining off the land is going to push that sand way out there, hundreds of miles offshore. That's the only logical explanation to explain that sand. But they don't care. They're finding oil in it. And they really don't have a good explanation of it. Some people try to say sea level dropped 6,000 feet to get that sand out there. But if you drop sea level 6,000 feet there, it's going to drop sea level 6,000 feet everywhere. That's just a crazy idea. But that's all they have to try to explain how that sand got there. They refuse to believe global flood. They refuse to believe there was a receding phase of the flood that pushed these sands way offshore. And I predict you're going to find more of these off Nigeria, more of these off the Amazon. They just haven't drilled that far out there yet because these are in 7,000 and 10,000 feet of water. Finally, the Tejas deposited a lot of mammals, even some mastodons before the Ice Age were deposited. Like in Tennessee and places you can find mastodons, but they're all mixed with marine fossils still. So here in conclusion, the evidence for the global flood stacks up literally into histograms, because who doesn't like a good histogram? We could do statistics if you want, but we're actually doing well on time. There's the volume of North America. You can see how it shows a progressive flood. You can see South America shows a progressive flood. You can see Africa shows a progressive flood. You can see Europe shows a progressive flood. It starts out minimal. Each of those little green areas, those are the first couple sequences. then they peak. So you see Europe peaks a little bit earlier than, say, some of the other ones, because I believe it's more of a shallow or kind of a wetland. There's a lot of dinosaurs in Europe because it was wet earlier and it flooded earlier. But when you add them all up, and there's Asia, shows a progressive flood at the end. Asia was really big, by the way. It took me 2.5 years to do Asia alone. It's a big continent, and so it really affects the world's total. So when you look at the total, take all 5 continents, here's the 5 continent totals, you see a strong progressive flood. First couple of sequences, very minimal flooding. Then about the Absarica, when you start to get dinosaurs, and you start to get land plants, and you start to get land animals show up in great numbers, is that purple, because now they're flooding more of the land. And just the ark is starting to float. And then the high water I believe is that brown area. That's the Zuni mega sequence. And then the receding phase is the most, because all the water, that's when all the mountains are popping up. The Himalayas, the Alps, the Andes, all these popped up. 80% of the world's mountains all pop up at the end. And a lot of that's a consequence, as John Baumgartner says, of those rapid plate movements and thickening of the crust in subduction zones. And so that's what caused these mountains to pop up, and that caused even more sediments to shed off. So it's not a surprise that over half the year deposited the most sediments of all. A lot of that's offshore. There's whopper sands and things all over the world. This is supposed to show a nice, here we go, the Sauk. And you stack on the Tippecanoe. And you stack on the Cascadia and the Absarica. The Tejas, the receding phase. So that's what we're looking at. And you see almost everywhere in the world is covered with sediments, except for those kind of green areas in Canada, still in Brazil and South Africa, and Ukraine and a few places like that, the Scandinavia. Those are the highest areas that didn't get flooded that high. 23 feet of water zipping across is all you had. So here in summary, here's days 1 to 40, the first 3 sequences. Days 40 to 150. Days, the receding phase, 150 to 314, based on the biblical account. So here's, I tie it back to the sea level curve. Day 1 starts with the Sauk mega sequence or thereabouts. Day 40 is up in the Absarica. And so it says, and the rain is upon the earth 40 days and 40 nights for these first 3 sequences. The water has increased and bear up the ark. By day 40, the Bible tells us, waters prevailed and were increased greatly. That's the Zuni and Absarica sequences. And the waters prevailed exceedingly upon the earth. All the mountains were covered, because the pre-flood mountains weren't today's mountains. Those all popped up later. And then the waters returned from off the earth continually. Genesis 8:3 talks about how the water, when it was dry by Genesis 8:13, Noah looks out, the earth was dry. But they didn't get off the ark for another 60 days or so, because you had to wait for vegetation to grow. There's no food, there's no vegetation. So God had them stay on the ark for 371 days on the ark. So the flood was not a 40-day little flood, just a little flood up and down. It wasn't like the flood you get here in Austin or anywhere else in Texas. It was a global flood. Every continent does the same thing at about the same time. How is that not evidence of a global flood? When every continent does the same story, all shows a progressive flood. One might peak a little earlier than the other, but that has to do with, what was the pre-flood world like? But when you add it all up, you see the evidence matches exactly what the Bible tells us. And we're the only ones doing this research. The secular community is going to just ignore me. And that's pretty much what they do. A few guys have read my book, Carved in Stone, where I saw the first 3 continents, the first patterns of these. And they read through a very prominent atheist geologist who writes textbooks used all across the country. He read through my book, and he never complained about my data once. He said, "We like your data, Tim. We just don't like your interpretation." But I asked him, "How do you interpret it?" And he got, he just kept, nitpicking here and there about this and that and that. And he really didn't like the part where I said it all points to Jesus, because he was an atheist. He goes, "Oh, Jesus was a charlatan." He ranted in his little letter to me, and Jesus is our Savior. Jesus is the reason why he was there at the creation. Jesus was there at the judgment of the flood. And he gave himself up for us. He died, but he conquered death. That's the beauty of it. We'll be made alive again in him. We'll be made righteous again, even though we're sinners, because Jesus loves us that much. The people in the pre-flood world, they could have got on that ark. There was plenty of room. There was plenty of room in heaven. Jesus tells us he's got mansions up there for us. We just have to believe that he is who he was, and he did what he did for us. And he's our only hope for salvation. There's nothing we can do. Jesus did it all. So here's, in conclusion, I kind of did my conclusion. There was evidence of a global flood, but we're going to move on really quickly through a catastrophic flood because people are like, well, did it just come up like a bathtub? No, it was very, very violent. You can see bone beds all over the world. I used to dig on these in Wyoming. There's some dinosaur bones like a log jam all tore apart. We see land and marine mixed together, land, plants, and fish, dinosaurs and fish. Talked about T-Rexes and sharks. Immediate death positions. Here's a fish eating a fish. Ate fish. There's the last meal for that fish at the bottom. Buried instantly, preserved it. So the waves came in so fast, they buried things so quickly, there was no hope of these things to survive. And we see coal seams. Flat and stacked coal seams like this. There's no roots coming through these coal seams. They didn't grow there in place. They're buried in marine rocks a lot of times, limestones above and below. Perfect flat bottoms and tops. How can these be swamps that build up over thousands and thousands of years where you don't see any roots at all? This stuff was transported in by the flood, is ripped off just like those tsunami waves show, and transported and buried just like the dinosaurs and the fossils and all the humans, unfortunately, as well. You see like this in Grand Canyon. The Coconino Sandstone above and the red Hermit Shale below, supposed to be about 1 million years of time. You look anywhere in the contact to the Grand Canyon, it's flat. We see these rocks are flat from here to Michigan. They drill wells all the way from here to Michigan. It's the same layer. Sure, there's a few uplifts here and there, but for the most part, the contacts between these layers, millions of years of time, is supposed to be there, and there's no evidence of any gullies or erosion. Grand Canyon is supposed to be 6 million years old. There's 1 million years. Shouldn't there be a sixth of a Grand Canyon cutting through this? There should be gullies. Everything erodes. You leave it exposed. Yet we see flat layers and flat layers. Some of these contacts in Grand Canyon between the Red Wall limestone and the Muav limestone below is supposed to be 160 million years. And it's perfectly flat wherever you go. How did they explain that? Well, they don't bring that stuff up. They never teach you that in school. They just say, oh, look at this. There's millions of years of time missing here. I'm like, shouldn't there be erosion? You can't ask those questions. Rocks really confirm a catastrophic flood. There's bone beds, instant burial, lack of erosion between the layers. And our final point is it's a recent flood. And we'll wrap up with this. Back to the bones. If you look at what we find in these things now, what they found in a T-Rex, not this one, this is Stan, found by a named Stan. That's why it's called Stan. Sue is called Sue because it's found by a lady named Sue Hendrickson. And so they named that particular group of people, named their dinosaurs on who found it. And so Sue, I think, is actually a male dinosaur, but that's another story. So Johnny Cash was right all along, I think. But the secular community says the bigger ones are males for whatever reason. You can't tell. You can't tell male or female the dinosaurs really, except for the ones that were pregnant, and that's another story too. There's a few that were, they can definitely tell they were females. But most of the big ones, I believe, just like bigger crocodiles, were probably males. As we go on. But what we're finding in these T-Rexes, they broke open a T-Rex leg bone, a femur, the thigh bone, and Mary Schweitzer in 2005 realized this stuff's still sticky and wet. She dissolved away too much in that picture there with the arrow on the far left. That white stuff stretched like a rubber band and came back, so it was collagen. And the red stuff is hemoglobin. So you've still got these original proteins in there of the T-Rex, the original proteins. And they've now found over 120 published papers in secular journals where they found osteocytes like you see on the right, and blood vessels, and red blood cells like the one in the middle, kind of in the center there. See those little red things in there? Those are still red blood cells. They won't admit they're red blood cells yet. They're red blood cell-like things. But they've tested these for the chemistry, and they've always shown that these are not just contamination. These things match up with some of the proteins we find in crocodiles and birds and things like that. And so these are not bacteria, like they used to say, oh, it's all contamination. These are real. There's still a few journals that won't publish these articles, even though most of them will. So it isn't the creationists finding this, it's the evolutionists finding this. But it's showing that these dinosaurs, these fossils, some of these fossils are worm fossils and things are supposed to go back 500 million years. That's a 500 million to you and me, which is nothing when it comes to the government debt. But 500 million years of time, and they're still supposed to be original? How does that survive? How does anything survive that's organic more than thousands of years? And it's amazing these things can survive 4,500 years since the flood, let alone supposedly millions of years. They have, again, like the Whopper sand, they don't have a good explanation for these. They have offered a few ideas. Oh, they bathe them in some iron solution. But a lot of these fossils, like those worms, are not found where there's any iron around. So how do those get preserved for 500 million years? And so the solutions, just like the Whopper sand, are not really well thought out, but they have to throw something out there to try to explain it. And so this, to me, is strong evidence that these dinosaurs and these fossils are very, very young. Just like those subducted slabs going down, they're still cold deep in the earth. Shows that catastrophic plate tectonics really did happen. And they don't have a good explanation for that either. And so they just don't talk about it. They don't tell you this in school. They don't teach you any of this. We've asked geology students, paleontology students, have you heard about the original tissues? And they're like, no. They don't even talk about it amongst themselves hardly, let alone teach the students this. And that's why you got to keep our publications, get Ax and Facts. Because Ax and Facts is free, by the way. It's free. Isn't it free, Dave? It is. It's been free for 50 years. It's free. And so you can get on our mailing list. It's free. Now, the books cost a little money, but everything else is free. And our papers, you can search our website. It's free. Because enough people, maybe some of you, support ICR. It allows us to do the things we do. But, the chemists have shown that these survive millions of years. They've tested them over and over and over. This is empirical evidence. You can watch these things decay in the laboratories. Under the best conditions, they can't even survive 1 million years. Yet there's all these proteins out there found in 120 different discoveries and counting that are finding original proteins that shouldn't be there. But would millions of barrels convince you? You might say, oh, that's 120 papers, just a couple little proteins. Would millions of barrels convince you? We have billions of barrels of oil. Oil is organic as well. Oil can't be millions of years old, even though they teach us this. Oil can't survive millions of years. It biodegrades. We spill the oil in the ocean, it biodegrades. Underground, it still biodegrades. A little slower, but it still biodegrades. Most oil we produce is partially biodegraded. So oil can't be old either. It can't be millions of years old because it wouldn't have it. You put gasoline in your shed, leave it out there for 20 years, try to put it in your lawnmower and see how well it runs. It doesn't run very well. Oil is the same way crude oil, what that gasoline comes from, is the same thing. There's billions and billions and billions of oil, especially here in Texas. Because they're the oiliest state, I think, in the country. Because you got all that West Texas fracking that's going on over there that people are against. Fracking is not the problem. People don't want you to find more oil is the problem. They don't want you to find oil because oil, that's what fuels our economy. It's cheap. Geologists, we put ourselves out of work. The reason I got laid off is we found too much oil. Oil prices dropped. And so that you find too much, you're too good at your job, you get laid off. That doesn't make any sense. So there's not a lot of incentive. So I got out of the oil and gas business, went into academia, which I found was even more screwed up. And so ICR, at least, is some sense to most of it. Anyway, finally, our conclusion here is it was a global flood. Hopefully those maps, even though you may not have understood them, they show that all the continents are doing the same thing at about the same time, and they all show a progression. And they show a progression which matches the fossils in those rocks. Progression because that seafloor is being created new. The more you pushed up the bottom of the ocean, the higher the water went. So it's no surprise every continent was flooded progressively at the same time. It was a global flood, and it was catastrophic. We see the evidence of the mixing of land and marine, the rapid burial, and finally, the evidence in these bones. Well, not this one. This is fake. But it's a $10,000 fake. It costs a lot of money just to get a fake one. But in the bones today, we're finding evidence that these things are young. In the earth, in the seismic tomography, we're showing the evidence of rapid subduction is real. All these ideas that we're putting forth are backed up by verifiable science. So in my book, I've got in the back, we don't want to take these home, so hopefully you'll take them off our hands. This is, I think, the most expensive book ICR sells, but it's 496 pages. It's the second greatest book ever written. Well, maybe that might not be true. But it was new in 2020. It came out right when the lockdowns hit. Boom. It's like, but we're still selling them. But this covers 3 continents, and it's the basic story of 3 continents, which I've now confirmed with 5 continents. And so eventually I will have to write a new book. But this has a lot of information about the Ice Age. All this kind of stuff is all in this book as well. Why there was an Ice Age? The Ice Age is very important. After the flood, it was set up by the conditions of the flood. Hot oceans from all the new seafloor, volcanoes, cooling the earth. There was one ice age at the end of the flood because it lowered sea level to allow land bridges to get from the Arctic to everywhere else in the world. but they're only temporary. But God had a plan, just like He has a plan for you. I didn't know what God's plan was until He brought me to ICR 10 years ago. I just thought, well, I did oil and gas, that was fun. Taught academic world, that was fun. But I'm kind of bored. There's got to be something else. I kept thinking, there's got to be something else. Eventually, God brought me to ICR, even though I was a sinner. But I'm saved by God's grace. And now I'm doing the greatest research I've ever done. I get to tell you guys, there's a flood. There really was a global flood. God's word, it really is true. Because if you can believe a global flood, I think the rest of the Bible becomes more believable. But the evidence is there. The evidence of the flood is there. Evidence of a recent flood, catastrophic flood, and a global flood is there. We just have to look. And I've had the opportunity the last 10 years to look, and it's just the greatest job in the world. I get to tell people God's word is true. That the geology really backs it up. And I put a lot of that in here. And I did win honorable mention as a readable science book, so it's not that bad. Look through it, feel sure. But there's a lot of information in here, a lot of maps, but it's written fairly readable. We have good editors. And Gary Parker used to work for ICR, said, I also show how it all points to Jesus, how it points to a creator God. That's the best part about the book. That's the part the atheist didn't like. Because it shows that God's word is true. And if that's true, then our only salvation is through Jesus. But He's offered it to all of us. It's not like you got to go pay for it. Book maybe, but you don't have to pay for salvation. You don't get salvation by buying a book. But it does confirm your faith. And you can also watch videos. Those video clips I showed you of the dinosaurs came from this 4-part. And then if you don't buy anything, you signed up for Acts and Facts, it's free. This is the best $10 book we have. This covers a little bit of everything about the flood, dinosaurs, the original tissues, evidence that humans and chimps are only 80-some%, 82, 84% alike. We're not 98% like a chimp at all. When you look at the whole genome, my colleague Jeff Tompkins did the research. He was a geneticist at Clemson. He compared the genome of the human and the chimp, and we're all about 82 to 84% like chimps. We're vastly different than chimpanzees. We did not come from a chimp. Some people like to say that in Austin, I know, but we didn't. But a lot of good chapters. This is the one book I would buy. There's only a few of these back there, actually. There's not that many for this crowd. So I would pick it up now because it'll be gone by the second service. Unless you're going to be hoping you could win the lottery and win one of those free books. But again, sign up in the back for the free books if you don't do anything else. And nothing else, sign up for Acts and Facts back there. If you don't get it, it's free. And we want you to get this because this will keep you informed. Keep you on the latest discoveries. We keep up as best we can. So, and I appreciate all of you that support ICR, even if it's just your prayers. We need your prayers as well, because a lot of people fighting against us. Yeah, there really is a battle. It's a spiritual battle, and a lot of the Christians fight against us because they want to believe the old earth. They want to believe the old earth stories. They don't want to hear what the evidence shows: a young earth and a global flood. And so it's unfortunate we even have battles with fellow Christians, which is kind of sad. But if you disagree with us, that's fine. But people write a lot of nasty things on their blogs. And so it's like, as you probably all know, but we just don't take them seriously. But what can you do? All right, thank you very much. I'll let you go, and we'll talk dinosaurs next.